Okay, I think we're live, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the decision by President Erdogan, the new Sultan of the Islamic Republic of Turkey, or Turkiya, to officially change the status of the Hagia Sophia from a museum, internationally beloved museum, which used to be one of the centers of Christianity or Christendom. Hi, Irene. Hi, Christine. You're first. Into a mosque, which it was before Kemal Ataturk decided to de-Islamify it, to change something that had been a mosque going back to the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire, to change that into a mosque. So this is back to the future for Turkey. All right, I'll shut the fan. I have the fan on because it's very hot in New York City. And it has been for the past couple of weeks, even though recently it's been raining. You've had a few heavy downpours, which really hasn't alleviated the heat, unfortunately. But it's kind of interesting to look at this decision. David Wood had a good video on his channel. Hey, Nate. David Wood had a good video on his channel, essentially describing why this removes any sort of defense Muslims have when they try to justify their attacks on non-Muslims as Islamophobes, for not being welcoming enough, despite the fact that Muslims are welcomed by the millions into Western Europe and Canada and America and Australia and other nations. In fact, there are so many Muslims that are welcomed into the U.S. that you have civil conflicts erupting in states like Minnesota between Muslims and the indigenous people, i.e. Americans. I'm sorry about that. That you can't really do anything about the ambient sound. New York unless you're in a recording studio. It's a terrible place to live stream, or you're exposed to the elements. They've been shooting off firecrackers and fireworks for the past month and a half, and you would think because Independence Day has elapsed, it's no longer July 4th. It's no longer even July 4th weekend. July 5th has passed, and we're into an entirely different week. You would think that the fireworks, the weapons grade fireworks and explosives would cease, but it hasn't. In fact, for the past hour, it's been sounding like people have been shooting off Kalashnikovs. I'm not joking. Outside, they've been exploding fireworks in my borough for the past hour or so, intermittently. It's not as bad as it was prior to July 4th or on July 4th itself, which lasted an entire day. It basically started before 6 a.m. and I think it lasted until 2 a.m. the next day. So that's a bit of a tangent, but that's just to explain the noises that you might hear outside. Fireworks, ambulances, cops. The last month has been kind of a disaster for New York City in general. I don't know if any of you were watching the news, but and I haven't actually walked around Lower Manhattan except for the Whitehall Ferry Terminal, which is around Battery Park City. So I haven't witnessed this firsthand, but apparently Soho looks like it has been sacked by vandals, and they haven't repaired anything. No, I'm free for the time being. There's been no repairs. There's actually a major lawsuit a bit further uptown, near Madison Avenue. They're suing the governor for essentially letting businesses be ransacked during the insurrection that took place. And Soho was one of those neighborhoods. For those of you who don't live in New York City, it's one of those very upscale, ritzy neighborhoods. And this is something that happened gradually during the over the past, because back in the 70s, a large swaths of Manhattan had been decimated economically. They were riddled with crime, violent crime, kind of like what's happening now. Someone in the Flatiron or Gramercy was just shot to death, which is something that sounds like a story from the early 90s. But Soho was one of those neighborhoods. And it became, the first thing that happened was artists migrated to that area, and they were sort of the pioneers, the ones sort of like on the Western frontier. You had the vanguard, the settlers that set up shop, and they were exposed to attacks. If you ever read Lonesome Dove, the Lonesome Dove series by Larry McMurtry describes all of these attacks that the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache launched on these settlements. So the artist kind of revived Soho, and then you had the big money, the nouveau riche, kind of go in, raise rents. The artists left, moved over to Brooklyn, places like Williamsburg. So by that point, Soho had become this very extremely wealthy, very expensive neighborhood in Manhattan. And it sounds like other things, like there are all these initialisms in New York, particularly in Manhattan, used by realtors to get people interested in these areas. So you have Soho, which is south of Houston or Houston Street. It's some people who come to New York sometimes pronounce it Houston. That's not how you say it. You can tell if you see a correspondent or news anchor on a New York news network, ABC 7 or NBC, and they say Houston, you can tell they're not from the city. They just moved here a couple of years ago. So there's Soho, which is south of Houston. There's Dumbo, which is down underneath the Manhattan Bridge overpass. There's Nolita. There's Tribeca. These are all established names of neighborhoods. There's some others that I'm forgetting, but they were basically they're basically initialisms used to attract people to the neighborhood, which became part of the neighborhood itself. Their names. That's basically how you refer to them now. But Soho was like that. It was one of these very, very crummy neighborhoods that was gradually gentrified through the migration of artists, and then they were pushed out, and then it became impossible to live there. But Soho, this is a very long-winded way of saying Soho was kind of destroyed during these riots. It was, and like I said, I haven't been there since this happened. I haven't been in that neighborhood since before the quarantine, before we were all put under house arrest. But apparently Soho, and for those of you who saw footage of the riots, that was one of the main neighborhoods that was just decimated. What was my original point? I started talking about this for some reason, which eludes me now. Why was I talking about New York City neighborhoods, or Manhattan neighborhoods? It'll come to me. It'll come to me one of these days. Victory Mosque. Yeah, there's some. Oh, the fireworks. Yeah, I was explaining why it's hard to record a live video in New York City unless you're like the videos. See, my memory's not as civ-like as I thought. But yeah, I used to record videos at a studio. Those were taped, and you could control. It was very. It was climate controlled. It was there was air conditioning. You could record, even though I didn't edit them. And for the record, I never edit any of my videos, even the ones that are pre-recorded that aren't live. I don't edit those either. I just record them and then I upload them. So there's no editing. So if you hear malaprops like that, if you hear malaprops, if you see me stumbling over something, that's the explanation, because I don't edit any of my videos like that. Like things like that are not edited out. But it's harder when you're live streaming in a city like New York, because there's so much ambient sound and noise. I mean, that's one of the reasons I like to see people who do these walking tours, who upload videos or stream walking around their neighborhood. It's kind of like an Instagram live for YouTube, and I actually do Instagram lives like that, where I'll walk around and record whatever's happening in my little locale. And it's interesting because there's some fast. That's one of the things I didn't realize about Instagram. I just assumed it was for narcissistic people, which I guess it is to a certain degree, but for those type of people to take pictures of their food or selfies. But it's actually a really creative tool that could be exploited by people who live in places like New York City, because there's so many fascinating and sometimes disturbing things happening in New York City that you can document with your phone, with your camera phone. And that was something I learned when I got an Instagram account. For those of you who are curious, my handle is at Kentile, Kentile, Floors, Floors, at Kentile Floors 99. So you can see me there. I would be terrible at ASMR, although there probably are ASMR videos that involve trash cans and other very loud noises. I'm not that in touch with the ASMR community, so I wouldn't know about that. But I'm sure there's loud ASMR channels. There's something of everything. Yeah, I saw that. That was cool. I used to have a selfie on Twitter, but uh, someone was kind enough to make a custom profile pic for me, which is what you see on my Twitter. My Twitter is at Gerard Perry, so it's my name at Gerard Perry 13. I think the 13 is because means that implies that there were 12 other Gerard Perrys who created Twitter accounts before me. So I was actually shocked. I guess it's such I didn't think it was that rare of a name, but I would have assumed that there would have been more. Some of them undoubtedly are bots, but it's either that or another explanation is that Twitter, there's a lot less Twitter saturation than people believe. I think a lot of people assume that everyone is on Twitter just because all of the media elites are on Twitter, and that's such a navel gazing profession that they they kind of they give you a distorted lens of reality. So it's not a real reflection of what's happening. 80% of the American public has never actually posted, has never actually tweeted. So it's not really an accurate reflection of what's going on in the nation at large. So I probably should have registered a Gerard Perry account earlier than I did. I had another Twitter account which was permanently banned before before the 2018 congressional elections. I'm sure that was just a coincidence. Oh, hi, Black Magic. That's interesting because you see a lot of people angling for a wrench. Unless that's reverse psychology on your part, you just want me to give you a wrench by you're trying to use a reverse psychology to persuade me to give you a wrench. But if it's sincere, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it works that way to a large degree. The idea that these fringe opinions, they are a lot. I mean, these really are fringe. These are fringe opinions that you hear, and they don't really reflect the reality of public opinion in general. But they're amplified by the fact that the people on Twitter are, it's the editorial board of the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and MSNBC. And if you see all of the blue ticks, they spend an inordinate amount of time on Twitter specifically. I'm sure they have other social media accounts, but Twitter is really their bailiwick. They they view Twitter as an alternative to actually going out and doing what they call shoe leather reporting. So 40 or 50 years ago, you would have real investigative journalism. You would have even people who were columnists, people like Jack Newfield or Jimmy Breslin, these people who were paid to write to publish their opinion. Even these people would do reporting. They would go out and they would go out to police precincts and talk to the captain of the police precinct. They would go out into housing projects and talk to the people who live there. These are things that the media and the remnant of newspapers that still exists. This is something that they do not do. They've completely forsworn. They've not. They're not. They just refuse to do it because one, they're lazy, and two, it doesn't buttress their perspective on the world. They can't create narratives that they want to promulgate if they have to rely on the actual perspectives of real people, if they have to go out there and actually talk to people and report, it kind of it hedges them in. It stops them from serving as as mouthpieces for whatever social narrative they want to construct. Yeah, critical race theory is a uh, good example of that. Um, yeah, a lot of these things start in academia, and then the way the pipeline works, it goes from academia through the press, then it's promoted by cinema or culture. I think the late Andrew Breitbart said something like, "Culture is downstream from politics," and this was something he observed growing up in Hollywood. His father-in-law, Bob Bean, no, Orson Bean, sorry, was an actor, and he actually worked. He was one of the first people to start, or he basically started the Huffington Post, even though it turned into a liberal organ later on. He started that, and he worked for Matt Drudge for a long time. So he was kind of steeped in Hollywood culture. So he had this idea that politics is downstream from culture, and I think to a large extent, culture is downstream from religion, or how religion is how religion operates in places like the U.S. For example, the progressive Christianity and its influence, particularly over Protestantism, began long before these academic institutions were taken over by Marxists and Gramscians, like way before, even before Cold War era battles over capitalism and the role of the United States. Even before that, you had attacks on institutions in the United States, churches, not physical attacks, but philosophical and ideological attacks on core Christian doctrines. And I mentioned this in another video, and I know a lot of people don't like to get into debates about Bible translations, but I think part of this was actually the Revised Standard Version, the attempt to kind of update or modernize the Bible, the English language Bible translation, or modernize the Authorized Version. But it goes even beyond that, just a general attack on, and this coincided with a gradual decline in faith. After the Second Great Awakening, you had people attack, and this occurred throughout the Industrial Revolution, and you get into the 20th century, the early 20th century, and you have a sharper decline in the people who believe in, because you have to understand, back then everyone was familiar with the Bible, even if they weren't believers. These were things they learned in school, and these were ideas that they were familiar with. Now that's something that's completely divorced from our culture. And this is one of the reasons you see people like Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom and all of these governors of states launch broadsides against Christians, and not just against Christians, but that's just a reflection of their hostility towards towards the faith and towards Christianity, but also towards towards Christ. So it's kind of like when Samuel returned to God, and God told him that they hadn't rejected him when they demanded that Israel have a king instead of being led by God. They said they hadn't rejected him, i.e., Samuel. They had rejected me. So God saying that these people rejected him, and I think that's what you see from the political class. So these were people who were elected by millions of people in the case of New York or California, by fewer people in other states. But the basic idea is these are people who were supported by a large part of the population, or at least a large part of the politically active population, the people that care enough to register their support or opposition during an election. And these are people that are nakedly, their hatred of the Bible, of God, of Christ is just naked. It's not cloaked in anything. It's not. There's no sort of dissimulation there. They're just going out and saying, Christianity is the problem. These churches need to obey us. There's no the protection of the First Amendment, which applies to the press and freedom of assembly, and religion, the free practice of your faith. That part of the First Amendment is nullified. We're not going to recognize that, and there's no real pushback. There's no real resistance, because this is a mentality that has captured the culture, particularly the part of the culture that establishes rules for the rest of us, the political class, the academia. So this is kind of the tail end of something. This is the tail end of a process that's been ongoing for over a century. And it's something that I think a lot of people weren't aware of. They weren't really cognizant of what was happening until you have a crisis like this, a pandemic, where you have governors literally saying you can't worship, you can't sing in church, you can't praise God, arrogating to themselves these dictatorial powers. It's not until this sort of crisis reveals where we are as a civilization. Okay, so we're running around a half hour, so I'm going to wrap it up. I'm probably going to have to change the title of the video once again, because we didn't talk a lot about the Hagia Sophia decision. I might address that in another video, but I kind of got off on some rabbit trails, as my pastor says, but which I still thought were productive. I'm glad everyone who came, all of the mods. I'm going to make Nate a mod just so he doesn't whine and complain on my next live stream. I'm gonna. So, yeah. Okay. So I think he's a moderator now. So that's but thanks everyone for coming. George, GW rather, Christine, First Corinthians, Irene, Black Magic, even though all of your comments were deleted. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a great weekend.